Hey everyone, this is Baphometrics. Welcome to episode 21 of Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. In this video, we'll test and compare the performance of the three clippers that I recommend using in this CTZ strategy. And just for grins, we'll also look at the performance of a typical mastering limiter, such as Fabfilter Pro-L2. So what I have here is a test project with 50 tracks total. You can see over here we have 50 total tracks. They're all identical. We're only listening to one of them. The rest are muted. And they all have a copy of KClip Pro that's doing 1.5 dB of clipping on this drum loop. And we're going to be comparing that against the same exact kind of setup with TrackLimit, with newfangled Saturate, and with Pro-L2. What you see here is Bitwig's CPU usage meter. If you've never seen this before, even if you're a Bitwig user, it's kind of hidden. This is the visual meter, but if you click this little thing, you get the full meter. And what this is telling us and showing us is I have a audio buffer of 256. That's my block size and my audio interface, a Motu M4. My project sample rate's at 44.1. And this deadline basically means how many milliseconds of resource usage, all of our plugins and synthesizers and everything that's happening in the project. That's the number of milliseconds that fills up an entire buffer at this block size, okay? And so if I go over that deadline, if I go over this value, I'm going to start hearing gaps and glitches because my audio buffer is going to start having dropouts. And the way you measure things in Bitwig is there's this visual meter and this, you look at this average number here, which is the average load of all your plugins. So we're going to play this real quick and see what our number shows like. Watch this one called load average. That's the important one. Okay, nothing too exciting. This blue stuff shows you, visually what percentage of my total CPU am I using right now. And again, DOS CPU is very different from your computer CPU. It really just means how are you doing on your buffer size and your buffer deadline on your audio card, right? If I were to increase to a larger buffer size, percentage-wise, this blue line would be much skinnier and smaller because I'd have a lot more headroom before I start having buffer overruns and so on. So that number was 0.450, and that was with 50 instances of KClip, all running at the same time, all working at the same time. Now, let's do the same thing and compare TrackLimit. I'm going to go through these real quick, and then we'll talk about what the numbers mean. All right, so we've loaded up the same exact project, but this time it's 50 instances of TrackLimit, and I'm pushing the input 1.5 dB into TrackLimit, so it's also going to be trying to clip everything to the same amount as KClip was. Let's see what these numbers look like. Okay, so our average there is about 0.530. Let's move on to newfangled Saturate. All right, so we have 50 instances of newfangled Saturate. Let's see what we get now. Okay, so we were hitting about 940 on average, 0.940. And finally, let's go test Pro-L2. So this is 50 instances of Pro-L2, Fabfilter Pro-L2. And we were hitting about 2.2 milliseconds, right? So you can see visually that a full mastering limiter like Pro-L2 eats up quite a lot more resources than any of the 3 clippers I recommend using for the clip to zero strategy. And yes, it's true that TrackLimit in particular is not technically a clipper, but it effectively works just like a clipper, just in a different way, to surgically control our dynamic range and our crest factor of signals throughout the project. And it's super lightweight, like KClip and newfangled Saturate. So conceptually, I think of TrackLimit as being a clipper in this context. It's just a different way to clip and control the crest factor of my tracks. And it may sound better in some cases or worse in some cases than a clipper like KClip or newfangled Saturate. And I did talk about that in the previous video, episode 20, where I showed you the detailed difference between what a limiter like TrackLimit is doing versus what something like KClip or Saturate is doing. And, the way that TrackLimit affects the signal is very similar, well, it's identical to what, a full-featured mastering limiter like Pro-L2 or Limitless or Elevate or Ozone or any of the mastering limiters, what they might do to the signal. TrackLimit does the same thing, just in a very resource-light manner. And so TrackLimit's wonderful because you can throw it all over your project. So what do these numbers tell us? If I were to divide the average load into the deadline number, right, and come up with a percentage, let me tell you what these 3 things cost in terms of your overall resource percentage. 50 instances of KClip were using about exactly 7% of my CPU at a 256 buffer size, right? TrackLimit was using 7.5% of my CPU at this buffer size. Newfangled Saturate was using 14% at this buffer size, and Pro-L2 was using 36% at this buffer size, okay? Now those numbers go down the larger your buffer size gets, right? So you get into final mixdown, and, the overall load of 50 instances of each of these is a lot less percentage-wise, and gives you more room for other plugins. But early in a project, especially when you're in the first stages of composition, a lot of people don't even like to run with this large of a buffer size because the bigger your buffer size, the longer your kind of lag or latency when you're trying to record MIDI or any kind of audio. There's a little more of a noticeable gap or delay between what you're hearing in the project versus what you're singing against or what you're playing against with your hands. And some people don't even like using a buffer size this large when they're doing their initial tracking of new sounds and ideas early in a project. So as you can imagine, it's very important to keep the resource usage of all these clippers as low as possible, especially in the early stages. Now, things relax a little bit when you're in the final mixdown, and you're probably running a buffer size of 1024 or maybe even larger if your audio interface supports that, and you don't care about latency anymore. This is why I recommend start with KClip everywhere by default, because it is the lowest resource usage. But TrackLimit is almost exactly the same as KClip And you could effectively just swap them out for each other wherever you want. And that's why back here in the last episode where I showed, right off the bat, the very first sound I brought in wasn't playing nicely with a clipper. But if I switched it over to TrackLimit instead on one bus, on one of my buses, it actually fixed the problem and everything sounded great, even with that particular sound choice. So there could be reasons why very early in a project, before you've even brought that many sounds in, on a couple strategic buses or maybe even on a specific source track, you'll just decide quickly that TrackLimit sounds better than KClip. And so you want to use it on that bus or that specific track. And what I'm trying to show you in this video is it's perfectly okay to just interchange KClip and TrackLimit as much as you want, because they use effectively the same amount of resources, 7% for KClip versus 7.5% for TrackLimit. They're both incredibly lightweight, and they solve different problems in different ways. Use one, use the other. Doesn't matter in terms of your resource usage. Now, you're still going to need to listen to what they're doing, because on some sounds, KClip will sound better, because it's going to, that clipping, the extra bit of harmonic spit that a clipper adds is going to actually enhance the sound in pleasant, positive ways, especially drum sounds for the most part. Or it'll be totally transparent. You won't hear it anyway. And since it's the lowest resource usage, why not use it, right? I would recommend to only switch over to TrackLimit when KClip is obviously clipping and you don't like what you're hearing, and you want to see if TrackLimit will sound more invisible, more transparent, right? So don't be afraid to switch over to TrackLimit, even super early in the project, because it's so light in resource usage. And then, the decision to try newfangled Saturate is kind of a later thing in the process, right? When you're in final mixdown, you can decide whether certain tracks or buses that have KClip on them might sound better with Saturate instead. Or if you started out with TrackLimit, you could see if Saturate sounds better than TrackLimit, right? Test all three. It's super easy to do, especially if you build a nice rack like I've showed you throughout these videos. It just lets me quickly A/B compare all three of them. Okay, so I hope this video has been useful, and I'll see you in the next one.